The grand hallway of the Silverstone mansion was the kind of place that made people lower their voices when they walked through it. Everything about it demanded reverence, from the high-arched ceilings painted with gold leaf to the tall crystal chandeliers that dripped from above like frozen waterfalls. Each piece of furniture was chosen with precision: velvet couches the color of wine, portraits of Grace Silverstone's ancestors framed in gold, and marble floors so polished they mirrored the light like calm water. The mansion itself was a monument to success, built not just with money, but with pride, the kind of pride that could make a person forget where they came from. That evening, the house was alive with sound. Soft jazz floated through the air, mingling with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. The city's elite had gathered for one purpose: to celebrate Grace Silverstone's latest business triumph. Her empire, Silverstone Holdings, had just acquired another major company, solidifying her position as one of the most powerful women in the country. Cameras flashed, servers weaved between the guests, and the scent of expensive perfume lingered in the air like confidence itself. Grace, dressed in a silver gown that shimmered with every step, moved through the crowd with effortless poise. Her presence commanded attention, sharp, composed, and utterly flawless. "Grace, congratulations again," said a man in a tailored suit, raising his glass. "You make success look effortless." Grace smiled faintly, her lipstick perfect, her eyes cool. "Effortless is just another word for prepared," she replied, earning a few polite laughs. To everyone in that room, she was the woman who had it all: beauty, money, influence. No one could imagine the cracks that existed beneath the surface. And Grace made sure no one ever would. Her reputation was her armor, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was allowed to tarnish it. Then came the sound that shattered everything. It was sharp and sudden, the unmistakable crash of a plate hitting the marble floor. The laughter died instantly. The music faltered. Dozens of heads turned toward the noise. Time seemed to slow as everyone's eyes settled on the center of the room, where the disaster had unfolded. Grace stood motionless, her champagne glass halfway to her lips. At her feet, porcelain shards glittered like broken stars across the marble. And kneeling beside them was a young maid, barely in her 20s, her hands shaking as she tried to pick up the pieces. The girl's uniform was simple and clean, but her fear made her look even smaller under the weight of so many watching eyes. Her name was Leah. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," Leah stammered, her voice trembling. "It slipped. I didn't mean to." Grace's face hardened. Her voice, when it came, was low but razor-sharp. "Do you have any idea how much that plate costs?" The room went completely silent. The investors and celebrities who had been laughing seconds ago now looked uneasy, exchanging quick glances but saying nothing. "I'm sorry," Leah whispered again, her eyes filling with tears. "It won't happen again." Grace took a step closer, her heels clicking against the floor like gunfire. "You're right," she said coldly. "It won't. Because you're done here." A nervous laugh escaped one of the guests, but no one else dared to move. Leah froze, her heart racing. "Ma'am, please. I need this job. My mother, she's very sick, and..." Grace cut her off with a dismissive wave. "I don't pay people to make excuses. You've embarrassed me in front of my guests. Get out." Leah's throat tightened as her tears spilled over. The humiliation burned worse than the fear. Every second felt heavier under the crushing silence. She bent down to pick up the remaining shards, her hands trembling so badly she dropped another piece. A few guests looked away, pretending to be interested in their drinks, unwilling to witness her pain. "Leave it," Grace said sharply. "Someone competent will clean it up." Leah straightened, clutching her small apron like it could protect her from the shame. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned and began walking toward the grand double doors, her steps slow, the sound of her shoes echoing in the hollow quiet. Grace exhaled, smoothing the front of her gown. "My apologies," "Everyone," she said coolly. "Please, enjoy yourselves. Let's not let one careless mistake ruin the evening." The pianist hesitated before striking a few hesitant keys, and soon, the music started again, but softer this time, less joyful. Conversations resumed in low tones, though now there was something different in the air. The admiration for Grace had turned into a subtle discomfort, a shadow behind every smile. Outside, Leah stood beneath the towering gates, the mansion glowing behind her like a world she could never belong to. She wiped her tears and looked up at the stars, whispering to herself, "I'll find a way." She didn't know how or when, but something inside her refused to break completely. Back inside, Grace lifted her glass again, forcing a smile as the cameras resumed their flashes. But for just a moment, one brief, unguarded second, she felt something twist inside her chest. A strange ache she couldn't name. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something deeper. She didn't know it yet, but the girl she had just humiliated in front of everyone was the one person who would soon uncover the secret Grace had buried for 2 decades, a secret that would turn her entire world upside down. Grace's face hardened, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. "Do you have any idea how much that costs?" she hissed, her words carrying across the grand hall with a venom that made even the chandeliers seem to tremble. The soft hum of music died instantly. All conversation stopped. Every head turned toward the scene unfolding in the center of the glittering ballroom. The air grew painfully still. Men in tailored tuxedos froze mid-sip, women in shimmering gowns lowered their glasses, their smiles fading into uneasy silence. All eyes locked on Grace Silverstone, the poised, powerful billionaire known for her composure and elegance, and the young maid kneeling before her. Leah looked impossibly small against the vast marble floor, the sharp shards of porcelain surrounding her like evidence of a crime. Her hands shook as she reached to collect the pieces, her fingers trembling so badly she dropped one again. A faint gasp rippled through the room. Her chest rose and fell too fast, the panic catching in her throat. I am sorry, ma'am," she stammered, her voice breaking. "It slipped. I didn't mean to." But Grace didn't let her finish. Her tone was sharp, clipped, and cold enough to freeze the air. "Sorry doesn't fix stupidity," she spat. Her perfectly painted lips barely moved, but her words carried the sting of a slap. "This is exactly why I don't hire people without proper training. You can't even carry a plate correctly." A few of the guests forced awkward chuckles, unsure whether to laugh or look away. The sound of their laughter felt cruel, echoing through the hall like tiny knives. One man muttered, "It's just a plate," but his wife quickly nudged him, shaking her head. No one dared cross Grace Silverstone, not tonight, not ever. Leah's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She kept her head down, her dark hair falling over her face to hide her shame. Her throat ached with unshed sobs. She had been working double shifts to pay for her foster mother's medication. Every dollar mattered. Every mistake could mean disaster. And now, in front of a room full of strangers, she was being humiliated by the woman she admired most, a woman she once dreamed of becoming someday. Grace's heels clicked against the marble as she took a step closer, towering over the trembling maid. "Look at me," she ordered. Leah hesitated before lifting her gaze, her eyes red and watery. Grace stared down at her, studying her face as though she were examining something fragile and worthless. "You can't even look where you're walking," Grace continued coldly. "Do you have any idea what this evening means? These guests are investors, people whose time is worth more than your entire year's salary. And you," she gestured at the broken porcelain, "you've just turned my celebration into a spectacle." Leah's lips trembled. "Please, ma'am," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It won't happen again." Grace gave a dry, humorless laugh. "You're right. It won't. Because you're finished here." A collective gasp went through the room. Leah's heart seemed to stop. She blinked up at Grace, her face pale. Please. I need this job. My mother, she's very sick, and I'm the only one who. Grace cut her off with a flick of her manicured hand, her diamond bracelet catching the light. Save the sob story, she said icily. I don't reward incompetence. You're fired. Effective immediately. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Even the music in the background seemed to hold its breath. Leah's tears finally fell, glistening as they hit the floor beside the shards of porcelain. She tried to speak, but no words came out. The humiliation was too much. Slowly, she stood up, clutching the apron at her waist, her head bowed. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely tie the strings. Leave, Grace said, her voice final. Before you embarrass yourself any further. Leah turned toward the doors, her steps heavy, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Every eye followed her, some filled with pity, others with judgment. One of the servers, an older woman, moved as if to help her, but Grace's glare stopped her in her tracks. Leah kept walking, blinking back tears that blurred the edges of the room. The grand doors loomed ahead, tall and golden, a cruel contrast to the world she was being cast out from. As she reached the exit, the faint laughter of guests resumed behind her, trying to stitch the night back together as if nothing had happened. Grace turned back to her guests, forcing a polite smile. My apologies, everyone, she said coolly. Please, enjoy the evening. Accidents happen. Her tone was dismissive, but her heart gave an uneasy flutter she didn't understand. Something about that girl's eyes, so familiar, so haunting, had struck a strange chord deep within her. Outside, Leah stepped into the cold night air, wrapping her arms around herself. The mansion's golden lights glowed behind her like a world she no longer belonged to. She whispered into the darkness, "One day, you'll remember me." She didn't know how true those words would become, because the woman who had just destroyed her life was the very same woman who had abandoned her long ago. And fate had just brought them face to face again. Stand up, Grace ordered, her chin lifted high, her tone carrying the weight of command that silenced the entire room. The chandeliers above shimmered faintly, their crystals catching the tension in the air. Leah's hands shook as she obeyed, rising slowly from the marble floor, her knees weak, her head still bowed. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, the kind that burn without touching. She didn't dare meet her employer's gaze. Grace Silverstone's eyes were cold enough to freeze water. Grace crossed her arms tightly across her chest, every inch of her posture screaming power and control. The faint smile that had once graced her lips for her guests was gone, replaced by something sharp and merciless. "You're fired," she said, her voice slicing through the air. "Right here. Right now." The words hit like a gunshot. The music that had once filled the room stopped completely. The servers froze, unsure whether to move. The wealthy guests, politicians, business magnates, socialites, stood in awkward stillness, holding their champagne flutes mid-air, pretending not to stare but unable to look away. Leah blinked, her heart thudding so loudly she could hear it echo inside her skull. "Please, ma'am," she whispered, her voice trembling as tears welled in her eyes. "I need this job. My mother's sick, and I." Grace raised one manicured hand, silencing her without a word. "I said you're done." Her voice was calm but sharp, as if every syllable had been dipped in ice. "You've embarrassed me in front of people whose time is worth more than your life's wages. Get out of my house." The finality in her tone left no room for pleading. For a moment, Leah couldn't move. Her legs felt like they weren't hers, her body frozen between shame and disbelief. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no sound came out. Her chest ached with the effort of holding back tears. Finally, her shoulders slumped. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered, her voice breaking into a fragile whisper that carried across the silent room. She turned toward the grand double doors, her hands clutching the sides of her faded apron. Each step felt heavier than the last. The sound of her soft shoes against the marble echoed like a slow heartbeat through the hall. Not one guest spoke. They all saw her pain, but none dared to interfere. To them, she was invisible, a maid, a servant, someone whose worth ended where their comfort began. A few looked away, pretending to check their phones or fix their jewelry, unwilling to meet her tear-filled eyes. Others watched with a kind of detached curiosity, as though witnessing a play rather than a person's breaking point. Leah's vision blurred. The grand staircase ahead shimmered through her tears, and the world tilted slightly as her knees threatened to give out. But she kept walking. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, not in front of them, not in front of the woman who thought she was less than human. Still, her throat burned, and one tear slipped down her cheek, catching the light of the chandelier before falling silently to the floor. Behind her, Grace exhaled sharply, brushing imaginary dust off her sleeve as though wiping away the entire incident. "My apologies, everyone," she said smoothly to her guests, reclaiming control of the moment. "Please, continue enjoying the evening." Her tone was light, rehearsed, and detached, as if firing a young woman in front of a crowd was just another inconvenience in her perfect life. The guests forced polite smiles, but the energy in the room had shifted. The laughter that returned was hollow. Even the string quartet seemed unsure how to continue, the melody faltering before finding its rhythm again. Grace lifted her glass and took a sip of champagne, ignoring the faint tremor in her hand. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, something unfamiliar flickered in her chest. It wasn't guilt exactly, but discomfort. Leah's voice had carried a rawness she hadn't heard in years, a tone that had stirred something deep, something buried. But she pushed it away as quickly as it came. Grace Silverstone didn't feel pity. Not for anyone. Outside, the night was cold. Leah stepped out onto the mansion's front steps, wrapping her arms around herself. The glittering laughter from inside the house echoed faintly behind her, growing smaller and smaller as she descended the stairs. Her breath came out in clouds, mixing with the mist that hung over the driveway. She looked down at her hands, hands that had scrubbed, carried, and served without rest, and clenched them into fists. She had been humiliated in front of people who would never know her name, by a woman who had everything Leah never did. Yet, beneath the ache in her chest, a quiet fire began to burn. She whispered to herself, voice trembling but steady enough to carry into the night, "One day, I'll make her remember this face." And though she didn't yet know it, fate was already preparing to make that happen, because the woman who had just cast her out of her mansion had unknowingly cast out her own daughter. As Leah walked away, the marble floor seemed to mock her with its brilliance. Every step she took echoed against it, hollow and heavy, until the sound of her shoes almost drowned out the faint music that cautiously resumed behind her. The chandeliers above sparkled once more, the orchestra tried to pick up where it had left off, and the hum of polite conversation began to creep back into the air. But for Leah, everything sounded distant, blurred, like a world she no longer belonged to. Her vision swam with tears she refused to let fall until she was out of sight. She kept her head bowed, her breath catching as she passed the long hallway lined with paintings and golden mirrors that reflected her small, trembling figure. Each reflection seemed to whisper the same cruel truth: she was invisible to the people she served. When she reached the mansion's towering gates, the cold night air rushed to greet her. It bit at her skin, sharp and unforgiving, as if even the wind knew her place in this world. She stopped there for a moment, her hands clutching the hem of her apron, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Tears finally slipped down her cheeks, warm against the chill. She turned to look back one last time at the mansion, that fortress of light and laughter, now glowing like a cruel reminder of everything she didn't have. The tall windows glimmered gold, silhouettes of people moving gracefully within, their laughter restored as if her humiliation had never existed. She could almost hear them, the polite chuckles, the clinking of glasses, the same shallow conversations continuing without her. It was as though her pain had been nothing more than a small interruption in their evening. Inside, Grace Silverstone took a long sip of wine, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she lifted her glass. Her expression was perfectly composed again, as if the outburst had never happened. "My apologies, everyone," she said with practiced grace, her tone smooth and effortless. "Let's not allow one careless mistake to ruin a beautiful evening." Her voice carried across the room, warm and polished, the kind of voice that could sell trust and power at the same time. The crowd responded with soft nods and forced smiles, eager to erase the discomfort that had filled the room moments earlier. The string quartet struck up a softer tune, and a few guests began to dance again, their movements mechanical, their laughter careful. But beneath the glittering surface, whispers began to ripple like a quiet storm. Two women by the buffet exchanged glances, their jeweled earrings catching the light. "Did you see how she spoke to that poor girl?" one murmured. "I mean, it was an accident." The other shrugged uneasily. "Grace can be intense," she replied, her tone hesitant. "But maybe that's what it takes to be who she is." Not far away, a man leaned toward his colleague and muttered under his breath, "Firing her like that in front of everyone. It was too much. Heartless, even for Grace." His companion shot him a warning look. "Keep your voice down," he whispered. "You know she hears everything." And she did. Grace noticed the whispers, the stolen glances, the faint air of discomfort that lingered despite the resumed music. For a fleeting moment, her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. It wasn't regret she felt, not yet, but something else, something she couldn't name. Maybe irritation, maybe unease. That maid's eyes had done something strange to her. There had been a flash, just a second, when Leah had looked up through her tears, and Grace had felt a jolt deep in her chest. A memory she couldn't quite catch, a face she couldn't quite place. But she brushed it off just as quickly. She told herself it was nonsense. Just another girl. Just another mistake. Grace smiled again, wider this time, letting the confidence return to her like armor. She laughed at something an investor said, though she barely heard him. Around her, the party began to breathe again. Music rose. Laughter filled the gaps. The embarrassment was fading, being swallowed by the mansion's grandness, by the illusion of perfection that Grace had built her whole life upon. But deep down, something restless stirred in her, something that made her take another sip of wine a little too quickly, that made her avoid the mirror across the room where her own reflection seemed to be watching her with quiet judgment. Outside the gates, Leah wiped her tears with the back of her sleeve and took one last look at the house that had just destroyed her spirit. The laughter inside echoed faintly through the night, carried on the wind like a cruel lullaby. She whispered under her breath, "One day, you'll wish you hadn't done that." Her voice was soft, but steady. Then she turned away, walking down the long, empty driveway until the mansion's lights disappeared behind her. Back inside, Grace Silverstone smiled for the cameras, raised her glass, and continued her celebration, unaware that the girl she had just cast aside was not a stranger at all, but the daughter she had lost years ago. And soon, the life she had so carefully built would begin to unravel, all because of that single broken plate. Leah's footsteps echoed softly on the stone driveway, fading into the vast darkness that surrounded the Silverstone mansion. The night air was cold and damp, clinging to her skin like sorrow itself. Her uniform, once neatly pressed, was now wrinkled and wet with tears that refused to stop. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, not just from the chill, but from the weight pressing against her chest. Every step felt heavier than the last, each one pulling her farther from the grand house that had taken so much from her in one cruel moment. Her throat burned as she tried to steady her breathing, but the sobs kept breaking through, quiet and painful. She thought of her mother, fragile, coughing, lying on the worn-out sofa in their tiny apartment. Leah had promised her that things would get better, that this job would finally bring stability, that she would never have to worry again. Now, all those promises felt like shattered glass in her hands. She didn't even know how she would explain what happened. How do you tell someone that you were fired in front of the wealthiest people in the city, that you were treated like dirt by a woman you had once admired? Leah paused halfway down the driveway, wiping her face with trembling fingers. Her reflection caught briefly in a puddle beneath the streetlight, a small, broken figure in a black uniform that no longer fit her spirit. Her eyes were red and swollen, but behind the pain, something new flickered, a spark, faint but fierce. For the first time, she didn't just feel hurt. She felt angry. Angry at the humiliation, the arrogance, the injustice. Angry that people like Grace Silverstone could ruin lives with a single sentence and still go back to drinking champagne as if nothing had happened. She took a shaky breath and whispered to herself, "I won't let this be the end." The words were small, carried away by the wind, but they were real. And somewhere deep inside her, she knew they were a promise. Back inside the glittering mansion, the world was still spinning as though nothing had changed. The chandeliers sparkled. The orchestra played softly again. Waiters glided between tables with trays of golden hors d'oeuvres. Laughter returned, cautious at first, then louder, as the guests tried to erase the discomfort that had briefly interrupted their evening. Grace Silverstone stood among them, radiant in her silver gown, holding her wine glass with her usual poise. From the outside, she looked untouchable, composed, powerful, flawless. But beneath that flawless exterior, something small and unwelcome stirred in her chest. The image of Leah's tear-streaked face wouldn't leave her mind. There was something about those eyes, brown, soft, and achingly familiar, that unsettled her. Grace brushed it off, telling herself it was guilt, maybe pity, emotions she didn't have time for. She was Grace Silverstone, a woman who built empires, who didn't flinch or falter. Mistakes were meant to be swept away, not dwelled upon. Still, as she moved through her guests, accepting congratulations and exchanging polite smiles, she found herself distracted. The laughter around her sounded hollow. The chandeliers seemed too bright. And when one of her guests mentioned the incident with a nervous chuckle, "Quite the scene back there, Grace, though you handled it like a true professional," she forced a smile but felt her stomach tighten. "Of course," she replied smoothly. "Discipline keeps order." The guest nodded, impressed. Grace lifted her glass again, but as she looked down into the wine, she caught her reflection in the red liquid, and for a brief, haunting second, it wasn't her own face she saw. It was Leah's. Those same eyes. That same trembling mouth. Grace blinked, shaken, and looked away quickly. She didn't understand why that girl's face haunted her, why her heart felt heavier than before. But fate, silent and patient, was already preparing to answer those questions. Because Leah wasn't just another maid. She wasn't another nameless worker who came and went unnoticed through Grace Silverstone's mansion. She was something far more important, something Grace had lost long ago. Years before, when Grace was still a rising businesswoman, she had made choices that cost her dearly. A secret buried beneath ambition, a child she had believed gone forever. A daughter she had been told hadn't survived. That memory had been locked away so tightly that even Grace herself rarely thought of it anymore. Until tonight. Until Leah. Outside, Leah reached the edge of the road and stopped. The mansion's golden lights glowed faintly behind her, growing smaller with every heartbeat. She turned back for one last look, her tears drying on her cheeks. "One day," she whispered, her voice soft but full of quiet determination, "you'll remember me." The wind carried her words away, but the universe heard them. In time, Grace Silverstone would hear them too, in ways she could never imagine. The powerful woman who prided herself on control was about to lose it all. And the girl she had humiliated would soon become the mirror that forced her to face her past, her pain, and the truth she had long buried. For now, though, one walked into the night with nothing but resolve, while the other stood in her palace of gold, unaware that her entire world had just shifted. Fate was already in motion, weaving their lives together once more, not as mistress and maid, but as mother and daughter, destined to collide again when the truth finally rose from the ashes of pride.